Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how the incredible demands of caring for a loved one might be changing the brains of everyday people? Well, this new study dives deep into that question. Imagine someone dedicating their life day in and day out to helping a family member who is facing serious health challenges. It is a huge undertaking, and we know it is incredibly stressful. But how does that chronic stress actually affect the brain's wiring, especially in older adults? Scientists are super curious about this, and they've been looking at two main ideas. One is that the stress slowly wears down the brain, like the stress process model suggests. The other is that maybe only the toughest, healthiest people even become caregivers in the first place, like the healthy caregiver hypothesis proposes. Which one is it, or is it a bit of both? This research wanted to find out what is going on inside the brains of these amazing caregivers. They looked at something called resting state EEG functional connectivity. Now, that sounds complicated, but think of it like this. EEG is a way to listen to your brain's electrical chatter using sensors on your scalp. Resting state means they measured this chatter while people were just sitting there, doing nothing in particular, just letting their minds wander. Functional connectivity is all about how different parts of the brain talk to each other. Are they in sync, or are they working independently? They used a special tool to measure this talk called the Weighted Phase Lag Index, or WPLI, and they looked at different brainwave speeds or frequency bands like delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. Gamma waves are super fast, delta waves are much slower. The researchers gathered a group of people who were caring for loved ones with all sorts of conditions, not just Alzheimer's. They compared them to a similar group of people who weren't caregivers. They specifically focused on certain brain regions known to be involved in memory and self-reflection, like the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, which are part of what is called the default mode network. They also looked at connections between the front of the brain and the deeper parts involved in memory. On top of the brain scans, they gave everyone memory and executive function tests. So, what did they discover? Well, it is pretty interesting. They found that caregivers, compared to non-caregivers, showed stronger connections, especially in the beta frequency band of brain waves. This happened in a few key areas. They saw more talk between the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, which are like central hubs of the default mode network. They also saw this increased chatter between the posterior cingulate cortex and areas in the front and temporal lobes, which are important for memory. Now, what does this brain chatter mean for thinking? The study found that these stronger beta band connections in caregivers were linked to slightly worse performance on some cognitive tests, particularly those measuring executive functions. This suggests that while these brain circuits are more active and connected, it might not be a totally good thing. It could be a sign of the brain working harder, perhaps to cope with the demands of caregiving. This study gives us a fascinating peek into how the brain might adapt to the chronic stress of caregiving. The findings lean more towards the stress process model, suggesting that sustained demands can indeed lead to changes in brain function. It is a complex picture though. For example, caregivers in this study were actually younger than the non-caregivers and had lower levels of amyloid in their brains, which is typically associated with Alzheimer's disease. This reinforces the idea that caregivers might be a specific group, and the brain changes they show aren't necessarily precursors to dementia, but rather responses to their caregiving role. The study involved 41 caregivers and 39 non-caregivers. It is a good starting point, but the researchers themselves point out that this is a modest sample size, and they'd love to see more studies with larger groups. Interestingly, the caregivers in this study were, on average, a little bit younger than the non-caregivers, and this difference was statistically significant. A really striking finding was the amyloid beta levels. Non-caregivers had significantly higher amyloid beta levels than the caregivers. This is important because high amyloid beta is a marker for Alzheimer's disease. It suggests that perhaps the caregivers in this sample weren't at the same risk for Alzheimer's as the non-caregivers, which is a bit counterintuitive given the stress of caregiving. When it came to memory tests, specifically recall on the free and cued selective reminding test, caregivers actually performed a bit better than non-caregivers, both in terms of total free recall and total recall. This could hint at some level of compensation or resilience. The initial whole brain analysis didn't show any major differences in brain connectivity between the groups. This led the researchers to focus on specific brain regions, the ones we talked about earlier, like the default mode network. But when they zoomed in on those specific regions and connections, that is where they found the interesting patterns in the beta band. They saw that caregivers had increased connectivity between the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, and also between the posterior cingulate cortex and those prefrontal parahippocampal regions. The researchers suggest that this increased beta band connectivity might not be a sign of better cognitive function, but rather a sign of the brain working harder, a kind of sustained vigilance or effort to manage the demanding tasks of caregiving. When they looked at how these brain connections related to cognitive performance, they found that higher beta band connectivity in certain regions tended to be associated with slightly poorer performance on executive function tasks, specifically the trail-making test BA, which measures how flexible your thinking is. This aligns with the idea that increased connectivity might represent a more costly or less efficient way of processing information. The trail-making test BA is like a test of mental juggling. It shows how quickly you can switch between different tasks or ideas. For caregivers, having higher beta connectivity while doing this test meant they were a bit slower, suggesting that their brains are working overtime, perhaps trying hard to maintain focus and flexibility. Interestingly, the link between these brain changes and memory wasn't as clear. While some studies show memory problems in caregivers, in this particular analysis, the connection wasn't strong enough to draw firm conclusions. This highlights how complex the brain's response to stress can be and how different cognitive functions might be affected in different ways. Overall, the findings seem to support the stress process model, suggesting that chronic caregiving demands can lead to neural changes. The increased beta band connectivity in caregivers, especially in areas linked to memory and self-reflection, might represent a brain that is constantly engaged and working harder to manage its responsibilities. So, to sum it all up, this study found that informal caregivers showed specific patterns of increased brain connectivity, particularly in the beta frequency band. These patterns were linked to slightly poorer executive function. This suggests that the brain's intensive effort to manage the stresses of caregiving might be reflected in its wiring, perhaps indicating a costly engagement rather than a freely beneficial one. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. The number of participants was on the smaller side, and the participants were generally highly educated, which can sometimes mask subtle cognitive effects. Also, they didn't have super detailed measures of caregiving intensity, like hours per week or specific tasks, nor did they get biological stress markers like cortisol. They also relied on self-reported caregiving status. The number of people in the study was not huge, so it is possible they missed some smaller but important differences. They really needed more information about the actual caregiving experience itself. Things like how long they'd been caregiving, how much time they spent on it each week, and how much daily stress they felt. Without that, it is hard to say for sure that the brain differences are only due to caregiving. The memory and executive function tests they used were good, but perhaps not exhaustive. There are other aspects of cognition that might be affected by caregiving that weren't fully explored here. This study looked at the brain at just one point in time to really understand if these brain changes are a cause or effect of caregiving, and how they evolve. They need to follow people over many years. Do these connectivity patterns change as caregiving continues? Do they predict future cognitive decline? This is a crucial point. The study drew from a larger group of people who were already at risk for memory problems. So while they found differences between caregivers and non-caregivers within this specific group, it is important to be cautious about generalizing these findings to all caregivers. This was more of a creative adaptation of existing data. More studies designed specifically for caregivers, especially those caring for individuals with neurocognitive disorders, are definitely needed. This research is a brilliant step in understanding the hidden costs of caregiving on the brain. It highlights that even when people seem to be coping well outwardly, their brains might be showing signs of sustained effort and adaptation under chronic stress. Future studies could really benefit from incorporating those detailed caregiving measures, perhaps using longitudinal designs to track changes over time and focusing on populations specifically recruited for their caregiving roles. It will be fascinating to see if this beta band hyperconnectivity is a sign of resilience, a warning sign for future cognitive challenges, or perhaps something in between, depending on the individual and their unique caregiving journey. What do you think about these findings? Does it make sense that your brain might work differently when you are under constant pressure to care for someone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more insights into the amazing world of psychology. We'll see you next time.